Okay, so our next section is going to be a big one this year. We heard in the opening remarks from Layla that we're anticipating this data to be in the RDCs in the early days of next year, which is very exciting because people are anticipating this. Before I introduce our speakers for today, I'd like to remind everyone that we're using the Q&A tool for questions. We have our Microsoft translation link if you would prefer to listen or read along in another language. That's just been posted in the chat. Once again, I'm your MC for today, Grant Gibson, Assistant Director of Research and Evaluation for the CRDCN. But more important than me are our panelists. So for the census panel, we have Leighton Chakraborty from the University of Waterloo Partners for Action program. We have David Price, Chief within the Census Dissemination Division, and Michael Hahn from the Western University Department of Sociology. He'll be moderating today. So without further ado from me, since we are at 12:30 and we can get started, I will turn it over to David.
David, over to me as a moderator. Right, sorry. Hi, everyone. As Grant mentioned, my name is Michael Hahn. I'm an associate professor at Western University. I'm delighted to be here today to moderate today's session. And, you know, we're hearing today about a lot of exciting data sets, and, you know, admittedly, a lot of the hype and excitement these days tends to go towards administrative data, new data sources, etc. But you know, the census still remains central for helping Canadians learn about themselves. From housing markets to labor markets, the census has been informing government officials, policymakers, academics, and the general public about our country since the mid-1800s, which is unprecedented. And even you can go even further back to 1666 if you want to include Jean Talon's head count. So the only thing that's better, in my opinion, than a standalone census is a census linked to other files. And in getting ready for today, I counted the number of distinct files that are currently linked to the census and are available in the RDC, and I found 11. But I know that more are on the way. So the census, if anything, is likely to become even more important in the future. So I've worked with the census for a while, and I've worked with some of the linked files as well. But I know that you're not here to hear from me, so I'm going to introduce our speakers without further ado. And I believe that they both have presentations, if I'm not mistaken. And my thought was that David Price could go first, and then Leighton Chakraborty would go second. We provided both of our presenters with some guiding questions. I won't share those questions with you now, but I will keep an eye on the questions. And if there are some things that, you know, perhaps we want to talk about a bit more and there's some time, I might bring some of those questions back up. So my biggest job is to keep time and to introduce the speaker. So I'm going to get on that. David Price has been working at Statistics Canada to provide researchers from academia and government departments with access to tabular information, as well as detailed microdata for the better part of 15 years. Initially developing the real-time remote access system and service, David also managed the Data Liberation Initiative. So he's a great addition to this panel, no doubt. And he was also responsible for providing federal access to data through the Federal Research Data Centers. Recently, data has moved to the Census Dissemination Project to redesign the census tabulation tools and metadata processes for the 2021 releases, plural, sorry. Our second presenter is Leighton Chakraborty. He is a postdoctoral research associate at the University of Waterloo. He is a lead researcher on socioeconomic vulnerability analysis and flood risk assessments at the Partners for Action program. Leighton contributed to several research projects, such as community-engaged inclusive resilience, flood vulnerability mapping, and developing cutting-edge research methodologies on climate change risk assessment, emphasizing a social vulnerability index for Canada. Leighton's research helps identify gender-based, I'm cutting through some of the description just so we can get with the presentation, move on to the presentations. Leighton's research helps identify gender-based analysis plus factors in policy decisions on disaster and emergency management, and helps develop equity tools for inclusive and community-engaged resiliency programs. Leighton holds a PhD in geography and environmental management at the University of Waterloo, and I encourage everyone to take a look at his fuller bio because I did have to skip over some of the fascinating stuff that he works on. So David, I'm going to hand it over to you, and please try to keep your talk to about 10 minutes. Same with you, Leighton, so that we have questions, time for questions afterwards.
10 minutes. Okay. That'll be great. Okay, so I'm just going to share my screen, and then I'm going to jump right into it here. So so thank you very much, Michael, for the introduction. It's been a long time since I've presented to any kind of research data community, so it's kind of fun to be back. And especially now, like I've spent the past 5 years in a in a production environment in the census, so it's kind of nice to revisit why we're doing all this crazy work. So it's fantastic to be here. So I've got quite a bit in the presentation, and I'll skip through quite a bit of it, but I'll just go through the story. And essentially, the idea today is that we did the 2021 census May, so it's been almost 17 months. We are releasing the immigration, well, we have immigration data coming up in our next release, which is just next week. And then we have one more big release of education, language of work, language of instruction, coming up at the end of November. So we're almost through the big cycle of the census, which leads to the exciting questions that you guys are going to have for me at the end is when are we going to get our hands on the metadata, microdata, and then when can you start to research any linkages? So, so today I'm going to talk a little bit, the census went really, really well. We had a lot of challenges this time around. I think it's been quite an exciting story for the census for the past 10 years in terms of not being mandatory, coming back to being mandatory, and then collecting a census in the pandemic when we had to adjust to not sending people to people's homes to collect the information. So there's a lot of things that happened. And part of my presentation today, I was going to talk a little bit about, the great response rates. And you have these slides, so I'm not going to go through in detail. But really what I want to stress with this early part of the presentation is that we had a huge effort put into communication so that we could reach everybody in Canada to get back to us and respond to the census. We made huge efforts to overcome the COVID-19 pandemic, even just within house, because we went from, in the office working with paper, writing manuals and getting ready to mail things out to being completely decentralized and figuring out how that works, to figuring out how do we get people to contact folks in rural areas and on reserve who they're not accessing the internet or they're not responding to the phones. How do we overcome those challenges? And it was a really well done job by the census folks. So overcoming those issues, we had wildfires, we had the residential school news coming out, and then the COVID. So a lot of my focus today, I wanted to talk about quality and how we're making sure that we put quality into the census and that we're actually allowing folks to, when they link to the census or when they're making their tabulations, they actually have precision measures that can work with these things. So we spend a lot of time identifying the sources of errors so that we can make sure that we have the right measures in place to either do the correct imputation or to adjust the data so that that we don't have the non-response and we address the coverage issues through imputation. So in the end, excellent collection. We documented everything so that we make sure that if there's biases because of the collection method, or if there's non-response, how do we ensure that we get the right folks covered for the dwellings and doing the imputations. And then the exciting part that Michael also mentioned earlier is that everybody's talking about admin data. Well, it's not something that the census is deaf to either. I mean, there's a lot of really, really good quality administrative data that we have used and done linkages to the census already. So particularly when we talk about income data, is that we have an agreement with CRA, and then it was there was an automatic linkage with the CRA tax information so that we could get everybody's income information in the census without having to ask for it. So it was sort of included by exclusion. If you didn't want us to do the linkage, you had the option when responding to the census to say, no, you don't want this to happen. So it was a really, really effective way for us to include administrative data right at the source of the census itself. And I'm going to go into a couple of tables and show you some of the results of that, because it's opened up a lot of doors in partnership with CRA, because we actually have, we have CRA information from 2015, and we have the consistent set of information this time around as well. But doors are being opened as well for us to include also 2019 information, and then also 2021 information. So not only you're getting the census day administrative data for the job that they had last year, you can take a look through time for those folks in terms of what their income is and what the story is basically pre-COVID, during COVID, and then as we're coming out of COVID, what's happening with that. So there's some really, really interesting things coming up with that CRA linkage. Like I said, I wanted to talk a bit about the quality indicators. For the folks who are familiar with the census tables and the quality indicators in the census, we've moved away from the GNR, which was a global non-response rate. It was always something very, very complicated to explain, because it was, we take the total non-response and then we do some kind of analysis with item levels or questions that weren't answered in question level non-response. And we came up with a magic formula to tell you what sort of the global quality was. And we've taken a different approach this time around, so that we're actually reporting for each geography a total non-response rate. So we can tell you, 80 to 90% of people responded. And then we've gone with a much more expanded view of the actual items that people responded. So if we went to a particular area and nobody responded about the house maintenance costs in a particular area, then you'll see that you've got really good income coverage, you've got really, really good demographic coverage, but you don't have really good dwelling coverage. So it allows you to judge more precisely what the quality of the information is that you're working with. Because like I said, the GNR, it could have been demographic information that they didn't respond to, or it could have been dwelling information they didn't respond to. So we have a lot more detail available for you folks to take a look and judge the quality of the information for yourselves. Control the mouse. So global non-response. So like I said, I have a couple of tables here. So on the StatCan website, there's actually a small section now dedicated to the data quality tables for the 2021 census. And this will show you exactly what I mean by the sort of the expanded view by item. So we have the total non-response by geography, and then the different response rates for each of the individual questions directly from the questionnaire itself. So it's quite a lot of detail that's available to you. I think I'm a little lost here. Hang on. Oh, I can just move that. Okay, so back to the presentation. Further information for the quality. We don't have to go and take a look at these. Basically, what the census does a fantastic job documenting not only the variables that have been collected or the concepts that have been collected. In the census dictionary, it goes through each of the variables that we have, and it gives you a historical look at in previous censuses, what were the concepts and how have they changed through time. So like I said, 10 minutes isn't enough to go in and tell you everything that's changed. But the link that I've provided here brings you directly to the reference materials, which gives you access to the census dictionary. And then it also takes you to each of the reference guides that are released during each of the big census topic releases. So essentially, when you're looking at the immigration release next week, there is going to be an immigration reference guide, and it takes you through all of the analysis that StatCan has done to say where we feel the best quality of the information is, what we did to mitigate any risks of poor quality information, and how, well, just essentially how can you use this data and what's included in that information. So tons and tons of reference materials for you to understand how you can use this in concert with other data sets. Finally, on this page as well, we've got the, for 2016 and 2021, we do have replicate weights that have been created for the census. For the 2020 census, I think there were some tables that were released with a standard error. For the 2021 long form data, we are releasing as many tables as possible with an upper and lower 95% confidence interval. And this is just for the folks who need to, do quick significance checks, and then also to see, if there's a huge variance in the data. It's something that you can see right away, either online or when you download the data and start taking a closer look at the numbers that you have. So we're trying to give as many tools as possible to the users to judge that quality before going in and doing more detailed research. Now, some of the, so that, I think that had more to do with the questions about our policy changes and what we're actually doing to, oops, that one, this one, to inform people. New content, we have, well, with the census, there's always the struggle. Okay, do we want to, ask the exact same questions so that we have a consistent measure through time? Or is it time for the census to change these questions because it's reflecting more what's happening in society? And the biggest change that we can see right now is the gender question that was asked for the 2021 census. So we asked people, previous censuses, it was always sex at birth. And now what we're actually asking is the gender, identify what your gender is. Are you male, female, or there was an open question for people who identify other. And that was our first, well, after the Pop and Dwell release, we did have the gender and sex release early in the release cycle for release 2, and that information is fully available online right now. We have to be very careful with this because this is new information. We can't cross sex at birth by gender because we're not some of these groups, and we don't want to create shadow tables for confidentiality issues. So it is a bit sensitive because we're still learning how to work with this information, but it is, again, all documented in the reference guides. Following up on that, we've had a huge expansion of concepts and categories. I mean, this is the 10-year census, so we do have more, we actually have questions on religion this time around as well. But language questions are a particularly hot topic right now, and you'll see that in release 7 that we have the language of work coming out. And then we also have the language of instruction. So this is it's sort of a complicated set of questions where we ask people, what language did you go to school in? Were you in French immersion? Were you in full French? And then what province were you in? So there's some really interesting analysis around language that's coming up in the next little while. And unfortunately, sort of a lot of these expansion of concepts, it's really in the releases that are coming up in the next little while. So I can't talk too much about them, but we had some technical limitations in previous censuses about how many ethnic origin categories we could have, how many languages we can have as well. So these things have been expanded because we asked users to list up to 8 languages and 8 ethnic origins. And we've been able to process a lot of this information and make it available in the detailed files for folks to work with. And then moving on, sort of the use of administrative data linkages for collection. So I kind of scooped myself on this a little bit earlier. The income data is the biggest example we have on bringing administrative data into the census for use by everybody, like the detailed income sources and taxes. So we get that directly from CRA. There's about 32 that we publish on a regular basis. And as I mentioned, we're looking into how can we link more tax data into the same census year so people can see the change over time, even though it's a snapshot for just the 1 year. Use of administrative data for the census. You'll probably hear more about this when we start talking about 2026 in the coming years. But a lot of the administrative data that we use right now is also to certify the quality of the census data. Because of these administrative sources, we don't always have permission to link them in and use them as part of the census. But one of the reasons why it does take us a full 18 months to do full releases of the census is the certification process to make sure that the data we collect is accurate and represents what the population of Canada is we spend a lot of time taking pockets of our information by topic and then going to the experts and making sure that their administrative data is reflecting what we have in the census itself. So I think that's my 10 minutes. So I know it was really quick, but I'll hand over, and I'm obviously here for comments and questions afterwards.
That's great, David. Thank you very much. Yeah, you were a bit over, but it was interesting enough that I didn't want to cut you off because you're providing us with, relevant information, important information. So our next speaker is Leighton. I've already introduced you to him, so I'm just going to step back and hand the podium over to him. Leighton, it's all yours.
Thanks, Michael, for a nice introduction and highlight my research work, what I'm doing at the University of Waterloo through Partners for Action program. So in today's presentation, I would mostly focus on how can we use census data to inform public policies and to conduct academic research and publications, and what are the challenges that me and my team faced when we are using census data. So that kind of, the highlight that I'm trying to focus into the presentation. So let's go back to the presentation and share my slides. Can everybody see this? Thank you. Once again, I'm working for Partners for Action for a long time, for about 6 years. Throughout my PhD program, we came up with some ideas to inform policies, what kind of data can support policy developments, particularly in the disaster and emergency management perspective, and to come up with inclusive resilience projects. And we found that census has the most ability to inform public policies. And by how? So let's go and check the use cases of the census data. So census has an ability to delineate place-based or neighborhood level characteristics of population. And these are particularly helpful for community planning services. And census data can be used to come up with a comparison between communities in terms of their socioeconomic characteristics and in terms of vulnerability to different types of natural hazards or environmental hazards. And census has a capacity to provide supports for gender-based analysis plus factors that Department of Justice has mandated in all of the policy development process, so that the policies in the formulation of the policy and development phase of the policies and programs, we make sure that everyone is inclusive into the decision-making process. And census data can be used to delineate geographic concentration of population subgroups, particularly Aboriginal populations and different visible minority cohorts and peoples from different ethnic backgrounds. And we can also visualize the characteristics of the houses and the populations, for example, dwelling counts, how many houses are occupied currently, and where is the highest concentration of population density and dwelling types, the number of bedrooms, and even are you renters or homeowners. And most important part of the census is to understand the demographic and socioeconomic characteristics, for example, the age, sex, language, income, education, occupation, immigration status, and the mobility status. Now, how can we use the data to link with some of the data? So when I was working in my PhD in doctoral research and postdoctoral research stream, I've been able to use Canadian Survey on Disability to link with the census data to understand like where are the concentration of the people with physical activity limitations, and where are the people with kind of mental disability or psychological disability. And then also I have another parallel study currently going on the pandemic, COVID-related pandemic. So I think the Canadian Census Health and Environment cohort linkage would be quite useful to inform policies relevant to COVID data, and that can be linked to the census data as well. The third one that I'm working with, the Indigenous Population Survey, which was before Aboriginal Population Survey 2017. So we have been working on this linkages with the census to understand better community perspective and how the characteristics of these populations differ from one another. The next is, the indicators. So what are the indicators that have been used in my vulnerability research and socioeconomic variability research? So as you can see, that demographic variables consist of characteristics of genders and sexes, and then, the age and senior populations, and then social variables, cultural variables, and also many other aspects of the variables, for example, economic variables. So we can particularly understand where the location of the highest concentration of low-income population, and what percentage of populations are having government transfers to social benefits, what is the shelter cost to income ratio, whether where is the concentration of the population where they are spending more money on their shelter cost. So particularly is an interest of CMHC as well, like core housing need population as well. And then housing characteristics, for example, crowded homes like unsuitable homes, and period of home construction, dwellings that are built a long time ago. So we can have these all characteristics together as a community level, as a geography-based approach to inform policies at the community level. So using that indicators from the census, I have been able to publish some of the fascinating research papers. As you can see that they have been published to the top rank or high impact factor journals, for example, environmental research and risk analysis is one of the top 10 social science journals that have been using for a long time the social characteristics and the linkage between social characteristics with the environmental hazard and risk assessment process. Now, while I was doing this academic research and publications, we found a lot of challenges and uncertainties. My team at the Partners for Action have been trying to understand how can we resolve these problems. For example, RDC-based data set has capacity to understand the census profiles better way, but the publicly available census profile related data are not actually properly organized. So somebody with less technical background will have difficulties to understand those profile level data. For example, gender variables are not actually distinguishable. For example, we can understand in one geographic area what are the percentage of male population, what are the percentage of female population, something like that. And then also we found that publicly available data set have either overrepresentation or underrepresentation or missing census data in some of the areas. I understand the difficulties of the improperly enumeration of the census areas, some of the areas where we don't have sufficient data. But for example, Aboriginal population and visible minority categories populations, in some of the areas we have more than 100%. Representing in some areas. That's actually clearly visible in the dissemination area-based census profile data. And then when we wanted to compare the census population characteristics between rural and urban areas, we had troubles because we don't have any particular cartographic or digital geographic boundaries linked to the census data that can actually map out rural areas. We know that population centers are used to identify the urban centers, but it's written there like, any areas outside those population centers are the rural areas, but there is no cartographic boundary available to map them out. And also, most importantly, what we face that lack of sufficient census data to support rural communities or rural municipalities. For example, some of the research contractors that we have from Partners for Action, for example, Canadian Red Cross and Halifax Regional Municipality and many other rural municipalities are trying to understand census data in a local way, but it is difficult for us to support them because, due to the lack of the insufficient, characteristics of the population into those small areas. So one of the particular barriers, as I mentioned, that population cohort or subgroups that are mostly based on the 25% sample and disclosed into the publicly available websites from the StatCan, but it would be beneficial for research purpose or policy development purpose or planning purpose to having access to the 100% census-based data across those local communities. At least maybe we can write some contracts through special contracts to StatCans so that we can inform policies or shape policies. So that's where I will stop, and thank you for the opportunity. And I'll take any questions.
Great, thank you very much. You're making my job easy. Both of you are done on time. This is excellent. We have about 15 minutes for questions. I'd just like to remind everyone to use the Q&A option that Zoom has provided us with. We don't have any active questions now, so while everybody's thinking and typing in their questions, I'm going to follow up with some of the questions that were guiding the session initially. And my approach is going to be to ask just generically, and either of you can answer first, and perhaps the other person could jump in if they have anything else to add, and then I might have some thoughts as well. So the first question is, so what advice would you give to new researchers who are interested in using a census in the RDC, but haven't yet? So what did you find along the way when you started working with these data, and what advice would you give them?
I would first advise what is the research question, what they are trying to answer. So if the census has a capacity to support that questions, that would be the first way to start with. For example, I had interest to understand equity, resilience, and community-based resilience approach, and wanted to look at the equity lens of the policy development process. For example, is there any particular population subgroup there differentially or disproportionately affected by environmental hazards? So which kind of data can support that question? So that's why I ended up with census, because census has the capacity to look at the Black origin population, or South Asian origin populations, Chinese populations, Aboriginal populations, so the different cohort of populations. So it depends on the research questions, like what we are trying to achieve and what are the linkages that census can be done. And most of the challenges that we found that, for example, census can be linked at the local dissemination area level because of the insufficient data set. So if you have a clear objective, so that we want to define a community where we have, let's say, 50 populations or 50 families are living, census is not able to answer that question. So it has to be like a higher geography level analysis. It could be census tract, it could be census subdivision in terms of municipalities, or a province, or maybe big blocky geography area. So that kind of questions that I've been always asking to my StatCan contacts and RDC directors, that how can we make it possible to the researchers so that they can access to the very local level high resolution data set that can be linked with many other hazard data or disaster data or any other data set that can be linked with. So my suggestion would be to the potential researchers to figure out what questions they have and what they try to achieve.
Thank you for that. Very good. Do you have anything to add, David?
So I guess I was taking a different approach to try and get at the same thing, but it may be because I'm biased, but the first thing I would tell the new researchers to go and talk to your data librarian to have them guide you through the process of figuring out what the question is. There's so much data available already from the census that you should be able, before even getting into the RDC, you should be able to narrow down your area of interest, your area of research, and have a full sort of set of data ready to go, and then where are your gaps, so that you can be really specific on your request to get into the RDC, because there are gaps. There's only so much we can put into data tables and products. And then it's really clear afterwards that you can ask for the specific information.
Thank you for that. And just to quickly add, use my role as moderator. I think one of the things that I would tell researchers is that the census is probably the gold standard in terms of the data sets that reside in the RDC. The documentation is better than any of the other data sets that I've worked with. So, if you're thinking about complaining about the documentation or the quality of the census or anything else, hold your breath, because a lot of the other linkages are probably less complete. So this is as good as at $750 million to implement. This is a fairly well-oiled machine. So, all the data have been imputed, etc. So it's a pleasure to work with. That's another piece of advice that I would give. Great, thank you. So we have a question coming in from on the Q&A panel. I think I know the answer to this, but perhaps you have some thoughts as well. How can the census data be analyzed in R? What is the barrier to doing so?
Yeah, I think from that perspective, I'm also responsible for providing the data file to the RDCs. So that's going to be happening over the winter. And we're providing it to the DAD folks, so the data access division, who have their data crew, who are going to put it into different formats. And I think once they're in the RDC, you can access it through R. So I don't know if there are any barriers at this point. So.
Thank you. Thank you for that. As the academic director of Western's RDC, I can say that probably the largest barrier to opening a large file in a program like R is the fact that our computers are glacially old. And one of the things that's happened is we're waiting until we move to a thin client network before we buy new terminals. So the most likely answer, I'm not sure where the person posing the question is coming in from, but a likely answer is that the computers are just too old and they don't have enough RAM necessarily to load such a large file. The 2016 census was about 8.5 gigabytes, and I imagine that the 2021 will be even larger. So a lot of time, these old computers just can't handle it.
I will add, working in the RDC right now, it can be a bit of a problem because R is a software that's very used to being able to talk to the internet, downloading new packages, installing libraries, very easy when you're not within the RDC and have an internet connection. can be difficult when you are in the RDC and you're not able to access CRAN. So that is a big barrier for now. When we are in the VRDC system, those packages will be automatically updated for you as you need them. So that'll make that a lot smoother. But right now, that is probably the biggest barrier.
Great, thank you. And my understanding is that it is possible to work on the census with R, but you have to have some sort of plugin that makes it look more like SAS. But I'm not an R user, so I don't want to say too much about it. Great. Okay, we have several questions. Another one is, given your disparate research areas, how would you extend the data set, and what would that enable you to do in terms of the research that you currently cannot do? Perhaps, Mike, perhaps you have some thoughts on this, Mike?
Yeah, I think that's more of a Leighton question. I give you guys the data. I don't do much research on it.
Yeah, that's a very good question. So I had a clear objective into my research project. So I was looking for what data can support that question. So I didn't have that much challenges, but challenges that I faced in the direction of research, like, linking the census data with other data set if you don't have a clear objective. Like, how can you, let's say I have a component of disability in the vulnerability analysis. So how can we get the disability data at the level of geography that both matches? So I had to figure out like what level can support the both of them. So I know there's many challenges based on the research question. So there's no specific answer to that. But I would say having a clear objective and discussing with the RDC analyst, like, what data can support them, and that resolves a lot. And in terms of the, capacity to use our GIS or Stata or any other, high capacity software to analyze census, I have tried all of them. So I didn't find any difficulties. Rather, it takes some time to, to load the data because of the huge, large size of the file. But, I think we are pretty comfortable to, if those who are expert in academic research and in technical analysis, they would be able to handle that.
Right. Thank you. And just to add briefly to what you were saying, one of the linkages that I know is on the way that I'm really excited about is the National Housing Statistics Program being linked to the census. As we all know, the housing market in Canada has kind of gone bonkers, and we are in a position where academic researchers can actually inform this debate and help steer things like the national housing strategy in the right direction. So I'm really keen to see that one coming to the RDC, and I understand that it is on the way, but it's not quite there yet. Okay, we have a question coming in from the Q&A box. I think I know the answer to this one. I'm going to send it to you though, David, because this is probably it's one that you'll know very well. Is there an API to remotely access census data via R or other software?
So, I mean, the simple answer is no. I mean, once we send the data out to the RDC program, it's within a confined environment, shall we say, so that it's not open for people to access through APIs. I mean, StatCan is definitely working. Well, the DAD division and you were referring thin client earlier, Michael, is that we are having. We're moving to a virtual infrastructure where folks are going to be able to have more computing capacity and a better environment for them to access the information, not necessarily from a closed room in a library somewhere at your university. So that we're working on it, but it's never going to be an API solution because of the confidentiality issues.
Thank you. And other questions coming in, and this is probably one that you can answer, both of you can answer, but you'll come at it from different angles. When you first started working with the census or any of these other linkages, what are some of the skills that you immediately recognized you need but don't have? So David, for you, perhaps, I mean, you either have you might have examples from your own experience, or perhaps you're getting user requests for information. You think, oh, maybe we need to develop this information a bit more.
Yeah, so like from the census perspective on that, like there's a lot of consultation that we go through to try and figure out how exactly do we get at the content and what's relevant to what people are asking for. Because we're in this amazing period now where the census doesn't have to ask everything anymore. There are administrative linkages that are going to be coming up that aren't just user requested administrative linkages, but it's actually going to be part of the census that we say, we can expand this information and provide it to people without extra obstacles. So it's really sort of being patient with us as we move through these new sort of agreements and technological barriers that we have to bringing these huge data sets together and applying them across the country to the full population.
Leighton, do you have any further thoughts on this? Thank you, David.
Yeah, so I think I already mentioned into the presentation that the most of the challenges that I face to discover the rural areas. So we don't have any specific identifiers into the census to cover the rural areas. I know the census subdivision, the administrative boundary has kind of rural municipalities, for example, 408 boundaries or 405, I think. And there are 8 boundaries that represent like rural communities. But other than that, and they don't cover all Canada, all of Canada. We know that, in the north areas or, in some of the Vancouver and Toronto based areas, also there are some rural communities. But apart from this, we don't see any specific identifier to actually focus on the rural areas. So because I know from my research perspective, it's very important to compare the rural versus urban, because in terms of access to the resources, we know that rural people has a lot of barriers, like, in terms of transportation, communication, having support, and many other access to resources. So, but I think it would be better to have a boundary file specific to the rural areas and, adjacent to any other administrative boundaries, it would be better. So that's my perspective.
Thank you. And just to add quickly to what both of you said. Sorry, Grant, are you jumping in? Okay, no, sorry about that. I think one of the things that when I started working with the census several years ago, and this probably isn't true for all disciplines, but in my home discipline of sociology, it seemed to be the case. We take a class in statistics, we take a class in research methods, we don't take a class in data manipulation. So a lot of the work that goes into working with these large files like the census is often you want to aggregate pieces of information up to the neighborhood level and then relink it to some of the individual files, and just learning how to do all those things. We were not really ever taught that in a course, and I think I would have liked to have had just a data course.
Yeah, I think, sorry, I'm thinking back to several of the DLI sessions that I used to go to where we have a couple of geography experts who are trying to teach people how to create the files that they need that are the boundary files, and then connecting it to the census, and then having the outputs that you guys are looking for. Yeah, that is, you really start getting to the advanced user stage quickly when you start trying to get out of what we provide out of the box. So
another question that's coming in, why does it take so long for the census to land in the RDC after it's collected? I get this one a lot as an academic director as well.
Well, I guess that one's for me because the census is huge. When it comes down to it, Michael mentioned it earlier, the census is the gold standard for data coming out of StatCan. We have massive amounts of documentation and everybody relies on it. So we can't make mistakes. And if we start making mistakes on census because we rush things, then faith in the census essentially disappears. So a lot of the time that it takes for us to get through, like, census is May 11th, but we continue collecting census data until August, sometimes September. So it's not like in one day we got all the data and then we're ready to go. It's, the collection period is 4 or 5 months. And then just processing that data and cleaning the data to the point where we can start certifying that it's correct it is about a 5 to 6 month process as well. And it's staged, and it could get very, very, I could go into a lot more detail, but essentially it's that quality is what we want to provide on this. So it takes a long time for us to make sure that, we ask the question, did people understand the question? Did we get the right information? Is it coherent? I mean, we've had issues where, if we take a look at the data, and then, one of the mistakes in 2016 was when all of a sudden the number of English speakers in a tiny rural Quebec geography went up by 1,000%, and it was because we didn't catch something in our certification. So we're very, very clear that we want to make sure that the quality is there. And because it's so big, it takes a long time for a team of about 100 to 130 people working for about 18 months to publish this information. And then, so why does it take? So we're going to make our last release, official release, next in about a month and a half. And then within about 3 months of us doing that, we're going to be ready for the documentation to be packaged up and the files to be created so that we can start sharing with the RDC program. So yes, I mean, 18 months does seem like a very long time, but it's far too short from my perspective, because we've got people working like crazy to get the data tables out to you folks. So it's there's a process.
Great, thank you for that. We have one last minute, 1 minute left. There are no questions in the box, but I'm going to use my my position as moderator to end that's the last question. Is there an administrative census in our future?
Can I be coy and just say maybe? It's something. So what's not a secret is that we've actually had a project in StatsCan for, it started before the 2016 census, and we've been measuring what can we do from administrative census point of view, what are we missing, and then what are the benefits and how can they work together. So it's a question that over the next couple of years, I think we're probably going to be seeing more administrative data as part of the census. I can't be specific as to which ones because those decisions haven't been made, but there is a huge effort being put into figuring out where those linkages can be made, and do we get the right coverage for what we're legally obliged to put into the census. And sorry, I'm going to go back to one of Leighton's questions. Like, you know, one of the reasons why we don't have ethnic origin for the short form is that we don't have to. You know, we have to have languages there. We have to have gender and ages so that we can see the population of Canada and counts. But the ethnic origin isn't something that that the cabinet has said we need this information for every Canadian. So it's more of a question of can we meet our legal obligations through an administrative census, and then what would we need to capture in a long form follow-up question. So there's still a lot of questions being asked, and how can we answer those? Like I said, maybe this is my cliffhanger. Stay tuned. There will be more news on that over the next couple of years.
That's great, thank you. I know that other countries are turning to administrative censuses, so there are other learnings that can be found in other countries. So that's great. Happy to hear and excited to hear more news. Thank you, everyone. We've reached the end of our time. I want to thank our presenters, and I also want to thank the entire CRDCN team for putting this day together. I think it's going very well, and I congratulate everyone. And enjoy the rest of the day. I'll turn it over to you, Grant.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you.